What if the walls meant to protect prisoners became laboratories of pain, and the people locked inside were treated not as humans, but as disposable tools for science? On the cold morning of December 10, 1941, in Manchuria, China, behind barbed wire and guarded gates, a secret facility known as Unit 731 began another day of unspeakable experiments. Officially, it was called the Epidemic Prevention and Water Purification Department of the Imperial Japanese Army. In reality, it was a place where humanity quietly died. Men, women, and even children, mostly Chinese civilians, along with Korean, Russian, and Allied prisoners, were brought here in chains. They were not given names. They were called logs. To the scientists, logs were not alive. Logs were meant to be cut. Prisoners were injected with deadly bacteria like plague, cholera, and anthrax to observe how diseases spread through the human body. No anesthesia was used. Doctors performed live dissections, cutting open chests to watch organs fail in real time. Screams were recorded. Notes were taken calmly. In January 1942, frostbite experiments began. Prisoners were taken outside at night, their arms soaked in ice water until frozen solid. Scientists struck the limbs with sticks to hear a hollow sound, proof the flesh had turned to ice. Then they tested different thawing methods: hot water, fire, or simply letting the limb rot. None of the victims survived. This was not madness. It was organized, funded, and approved by military command. And the world, for years, knew nothing. But Unit 731 was not alone. The horrors unfolding in Unit 731 were not an isolated nightmare. Across the world, behind prison walls and under government authority, human lives were quietly sacrificed in the name of progress. On April 1, 1945, as World War II neared its end, American forces advanced closer to Japanese-held territories. Inside Unit 731, orders were given to erase evidence. Prisoners were poisoned, shot, or burned alive. Entire buildings were destroyed. By August 1945, when Japan surrendered, thousands of victims had vanished without names, graves, or justice. But the cruelty did not end in Asia. In the United States, beginning in 1932, a study known as the Tuskegee Syphilis Experiment quietly began in Macon County, Alabama. 600 African-American men, most of them poor sharecroppers, were enrolled by the U.S. Public Health Service. They were told they were receiving free medical care. The truth was far darker. Doctors knowingly allowed syphilis, a deadly but treatable disease, to destroy their bodies. Even after penicillin became the official cure in 1947, treatment was deliberately withheld. The men were observed as the disease caused blindness, insanity, organ failure, and death. Their wives were infected. Their children were born with congenital syphilis. The experiment continued for 40 years. No consent, no warning, no mercy. These men were not prisoners behind bars, but they were prisoners of deception. Their suffering was documented in medical journals, praised as valuable data. Science advanced. Human dignity collapsed. And still, the worst chapters were yet to be revealed. In Nazi Germany, between 1939 and 1945, concentration camps became living laboratories where cruelty wore white coats. At Auschwitz, Dachau, and Ravensbrück, prisoners were forced into experiments designed to serve war-not humanity. On February 23, 1942, at Dachau concentration camp, German doctors began high-altitude experiments for the Luftwaffe. Prisoners were locked inside low-pressure chambers that simulated extreme altitudes. As oxygen disappeared, their lungs collapsed, brains swelled, and many screamed until silence replaced them. Autopsies were performed immediately to study organ damage. Over 200 prisoners died in these tests alone. Cold water immersion experiments followed. Naked prisoners were submerged in freezing tanks for hours to test how long German pilots could survive in icy seas. Doctors recorded the moment the heart stopped. Some prisoners were rewarmed. Others were dissected. At Auschwitz, Dr. Joseph Mengele, later known as the Angel of Death, focused on twins. Children were injected with chemicals to change eye color. Limbs were amputated without anesthesia. When one twin died, the other was killed, so their bodies could be compared side by side. Dates, charts, measurements, everything was carefully documented. What made these experiments truly terrifying was not chaos, but precision. The The scientists believed they were serving a higher purpose. They believed morality could be suspended for results. When the war ended in May 1945, many of these doctors claimed they were just following orders. Some were executed. Many escaped. A few continued practicing medicine. The victims, however, never returned. And still, the world allowed similar horrors to happen again, this time in silence. During peace. After the world witnessed the horrors of Nazi camps and promised never again, cruelty did not disappear. It only changed its language. During the Cold War, fear replaced war as justification. In 1953, inside a prison hospital in Lexington, Kentucky, the United States government secretly launched experiments under a larger program later known as MKUltra. Prisoners, many addicted, poor, or mentally ill, were offered reduced sentences or drugs in exchange for participation. What they received instead was psychological destruction. They were given massive doses of LSD, sometimes for weeks at a time, without informed consent. Scientists wanted to see if the human mind could be broken, erased, or controlled. Some prisoners screamed for days. Others never recovered. Records show that at least one man, Frank Olson, died after being unknowingly dosed. His death, officially labeled an accident, at the same time. In Holmesburg Prison, Pennsylvania, between 1951 and 1974, dermatologist Dr. Albert Kligman conducted experiments on inmates. Prisoners' skin was deliberately burned, infected, and exposed to toxic chemicals including dioxin, one of the most dangerous substances known to science. Inmates were paid a few dollars. Long-term health effects were ignored. Across the ocean, in the Soviet Union, political prisoners were used in radiation exposure tests during the 1950s. Some were placed near nuclear materials to observe how quickly sickness developed. Death certificates listed vague causes. Families were never told the truth. These experiments were not driven by desperation. They were driven by power, by the belief that some lives were worth less than data, and the world looked away again. By the late 1960s, whispers of these experiments began to surface, but justice remained distant. Governments denied responsibility. Documents were classified. Survivors were silenced by fear, shame, or death. In 1963, at the Jewish Chronic Disease Hospital in Brooklyn, American researchers injected live cancer cells into elderly patients without their consent. Many of them were poor, mentally ill, or did not speak English. Doctors claimed the patients were too weak to understand, so permission was unnecessary. The goal was to observe immune response. The cost was human trust. In 1966, U.S. researcher Dr. Henry Beecher published a report in the New England Journal of Medicine revealing 22 unethical human experiments conducted across America. His warning was clear. These were not accidents. They were systematic failures of morality. Meanwhile, in South Africa, during the apartheid era, prisons became testing grounds for chemical and biological agents under Project Coast in the 1980s. Black prisoners were allegedly exposed to experimental drugs designed to suppress fertility and alter behavior. Evidence later emerged through the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, but most perpetrators were never punished. Across decades and continents, one pattern repeated: prisoners, minorities, and the powerless were chosen because resistance was impossible. By 1974, public outrage finally forced the United States to pass the National Research Act, leading to modern ethical rules like informed consent and review boards. These laws were written in ink but paid for in blood. The experiments ended on paper, but the trauma did not. The true tragedy of these experiments is not only the pain inflicted, but how bizarrely the world moved on. Most victims never received justice. Many names were never recorded. Their bodies were burned, buried, or erased from history. In 1947, while the world condemned Nazi doctors at the Nuremberg trials, the scientists of Unit 731 were secretly granted immunity by the United States in exchange for their research data. No trials, no punishment. Their knowledge was considered more valuable than human lives. Survivors carried scars that medicine could not heal. Prisoners who lived through these experiments struggled with chronic pain, mental illness, infertility, and nightmares that never ended. Families were left without answers. Governments offered apologies decades later, when most victims were already dead. These experiments forced humanity to confront an uncomfortable truth. Cruelty does not begin with monsters. It begins with justification, with paperwork, with the belief that some people matter less. Today, ethical guidelines exist because of these crimes. Every consent form, every review board, every medical law stands on the suffering of those who never agreed to be sacrificed. They were prisoners, they were powerless, but they were human, and if we forget what was done to them, history has shown it will happen again.